I decided to research why so many African countries import so much of their food instead of growing it themselves. My dad lives in Angola, and he's told me about how expensive groceries are over there, especially produce. And it didn't make sense to me why they would import so much food instead of just growing it themselves. Many African countries are net food importers, which means that they import more food than they export. Lots of wealthy countries are net food importers, like the US or Japan, but these wealthy countries could choose to be food sufficient if they wanted to be. African countries that are net food importers are doing it because they need to. They are food insecure, and if they didn't import food, they wouldn't have enough food to feed their populations. Of the top 30 countries that are unable to produce their own food worldwide, 25 are in Africa. Food insecurity in Africa has increased in the past 3 decades. In 1980, food imports and exports were nearly balanced, but since then, imports have exceeded exports, and currently, African food imports are $22 billion more than exports, as you can see in this graph. Many of these African countries that are net food importers also rely heavily on their own agriculture to feed their populations. There are many economies in West Africa and the Sahel. Sierra Leone's economic dependency on agriculture has increased from 42 to 60% over the last 4 decades. A few other examples of countries with high dependency on agriculture is Kenya, Ethiopia and Liberia with 34%, and Chad with 49%. These countries in blue, light blue, are the ones that are more heavily dependent on their agriculture. It confused me how so many African countries could be net food importers, but still rely so much on their own agriculture. According to a paper by the Food and Organization of the United Nations, the reason for this is mainly due to Africa's rapid population growth, low and stagnating agricultural productivity, policy distortions, weak institutions, and poor infrastructure. Even though many African countries depend on their agricultural production, they are not productive enough to sustain their rapidly growing populations. There are many reasons why this is, as some I just mentioned before, and we also read about some of this in our textbook about the failure of the Green Revolution in Africa. But because they're not producing enough to feed their populations, they are food insecure, and so they need to import food from elsewhere. Um, the increase in food imports since the mid 1970s has been particularly striking because they're importing basic foodstuffs like dairy products, oils and fats, meat products, sugars, and especially cereals, implying that food import has been increasingly important in ensuring food security. So they need this, not just like, a luxury. So some geographic principles of this issue is population pyramids, colonial impacts, and history on food, and insulation. Um, Firstly, probably the biggest issue contributing to food insecurity and net food imports in Africa is the rapidly growing populations. While Africa's food imports have increased in the past few decades, it has mostly increased just to keep up with the population. The population of Africa is growing faster than anywhere else in the world. In 2019, the population of Africa was 1.3 billion, and in 2050, it's estimated to be 2.5 billion. This was a change from around 17% of the world's population to around 25.5% of the world's population. In comparison, nearly every other region in the world is expected to have a smaller percent in the world's population by 2050 compared to today. So Africa is growing the fastest. Many African agricultural infrastructures and technologies are not equipped to handle the rapid growth of their population. This is partly because of the colonial legacy in most of Africa, where the Europeans they made infrastructure in the parts of the city where they were living, but nowhere else. And so rural Africa doesn't have much infrastructure. Also, their rapidly growing population means that they have population momentum built into their pyramid. So as all these kids on the base get older, they're going to have their own kids. And so the population will continue to increase for the foreseeable future. Um, One of the results of colonization was a change in food preferences by the colonizers. This could mean that many African countries now have staples such as wheat as part of their diet when wheat was not originally grown in Africa, which could affect the amount of cereals Africa imports. Lastly, the amount of insulation Africa gets could affect its agricultural productivity and so how much food it imports. Most of Africa is in the tropics, which means most of Africa gets the direct rays of the sun for part of the year. There's a cap to the amount of sunlight plants can get before they start photosynthesizing less. The amount of sunlight Africa receives is higher than this cap, and so agriculture productivity in Africa is less than in other parts of the world just because of where it is geographically. Mid latitudes have the highest net photosynthesis, and so they're most agriculturally productive. In the tropics, 50 to 60% of photosynthetic energy is lost due to respiration because of the intense sun and heat. So those are some reasons for African net food imports. Thank you very much.